Well, I was going to ask you about limb hairs. Let me ask you that later. Right now, can you please tell us, sir, how you begin, how you conduct an examination of hairs?
Well, back again a little bit here. The first thing I do, once the hairs are prepared on glass microscope slides, is to examine the hair to determine animal, human, racial origin, and part of the body it came from. I do that with all the question items. The question items may be from the clothing of the victim, and it may be several items, and they're all mounted on separate slides. The clothing of the suspect, again, they're mounted on separate slides. I go through starting at Q1, question item number 1, and I move through the case, getting an idea as to what kind of hairs I'm seeing on the victim's clothes, what kind of hairs I'm seeing on the suspect's clothes. I then go to the known hairs, I examine the knowns, describe them in note form, but the notes are taken just for me to make sure that I look at everything and also to highlight some of the characteristics that are being seen. And ultimately, take the question hairs using a comparison microscope and comparing them with that instrument.
All right. Would you please describe the process by which hairs and fibers are mounted on slides?
Sure. Uh, the hairs and fibers that are recovered from the clothing of an individual are often retained in either paper folds or in plastic pill boxes or however. That, let's say a pill box, is taken to a stereo microscope and then examined carefully to see if there's anything in it. Are there hairs in it? Are there fibers in it? What else do I see? And then those hairs are removed individually. Now, before you start even working on this, that whole area is cleaned off and you make sure that there's nothing on it that's going to be added to your case. A clean glass microscope slide is placed down on some clean paper. The hairs are then removed individually and mounted on that slide. First thing I do is I place a thin film of a solvent called xylene, and it allows the hairs to stick to it.
May I interrupt you, sir? We have photographs. Would you like to narrate the photographs so the jury can see the process?
That would be fine.
Okay. Can I ask that this series of photographs be marked collectively as People's 461, Your Honor? With,
Yes.
And this would be A?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you please tell the jury what we see in 461A?
Well, we see an examiner that used to have dark brown hair, but he's
that you?
changed a little bit. Yeah, hairs do change a little bit. But what I'm doing here is looking through the stereo microscope and looking at a pill box that contains hairs and fibers that may have been collected from a particular item of evidence. The stereo binocular microscope allows me to look at the material from a three-dimensional look. The mechanics of it, or the optics, are set up in such a way that you're looking at it three-dimensionally, so you can focus up and down and see what's underneath things.
Okay. Can you tell us what's being done in this picture? 461B, Your Honor?
Yes.
Right here, you see the examiner removing a hair from the pill box in preparation for placing it on the glass microscope slide. Each hair would be measured. I mean, there's a ruler generally laid down for the purposes of determining the length of the hair before it's mounted on the slide.
Now, you're using a pill box there to contain the hair and fiber that you recover from evidence. Have you ever heard of people using paper bindles to contain hair and fiber collected from evidence?
Well, I never heard the word bindle until I got to this case, but we've always heard them as druggist folds or paper folds. So if you want me to call them a bindle, I'll call them a bindle.
You don't have to call them.
Okay.
You can call them paper folds. You've seen that before,
I've
have you?
seen it come all kinds of ways.
Is there anything wrong with collecting the hair and fiber that is recovered from evidence into a paper fold instead of a pill box?
No, I think it's just easier to work with a pill box from an examiner standpoint because you can actually see what's in it. But paper folds are fine.
And paper folds are what you received from Susan Brockbank of LAPD in this case.
I did, yes.
Please tell us what we're seeing here in 461C.
Okay, I've already mentioned that once you take the hair out of the pillbox, you place it on the slide with some forceps.
Do you ever do that with your hands?
You can use your hands, sure. Yeah, you may have to hang on to the end of the hair when you're measuring it. You just hold one end and hold the other with the forceps, or you can use two forceps. You always have to be careful with forceps because you can pinch the hair, you can break the hair. It's kind of a little delicate operation. But yeah, you can use your hands. As long as your hands are clean, that's not a problem.
And in this photograph, sir? 461D?
Okay, once the hair has been positioned on the glass slide, now this glass slide is like 1 inch by 3 inches, and on one end there's an area that you can write on it as to what you're putting on this slide. You place the hair on it, you blot out the excess solvent with some blotter paper, and you place a few drops of permount, which is a mounting media. It's like glue. It's a yellowish substance. It looks, you don't really see the color microscopically, but it's place 3 or 4 drops on the slide, and then you lay the cover slip down on top of that.
Now, the xylene that you mentioned before, a solvent, is that the process being shown in this photograph, 461E?
Right, this would have been the step just prior to putting on the permount. Right.
Why is it used? Why do you do this?
Well, it's just used for, well, for one thing, it blends with permount. It mixes with it. You couldn't use water. You would have to use something that would mix with the glue type substance you're using. So you actually just to hold the material in place. If you're working with fibers, you can't put a fiber down on a clean, just dry glass because the slightest air movement could move that fiber off the slide. So you just use it to stick things on the slide while you're taking material out of your paper fold or your plastic pillbox or from a hatchet or whatever you're taking it off of, just so you don't lose it.
Does either the solvent, xylene, or permount affect the hair or fiber in any way in terms of its appearance? Does it alter or damage it?
No, it just allows you to see it better.
Let me ask you about that. If you were to examine a hair or fiber mounted on a slide with water instead of permount, would that be a good or bad thing?
I wouldn't do it.
And why is that?
I wouldn't recommend it either. Well, because there's too much contrast. If the hair or the fiber, or these other materials, have properties that are not very clearly visible when you use water. I mean, you could use some other materials too, but if the properties of that liquid are such that it's quite a bit different than what the item you're looking at is, you'll have a large amount of contrast, and you won't be able to see actually inside the characteristics of that material.
Might the use of a water mount also inhibit or affect your ability to determine how many hairs you have on a slide?
Well, very easily, especially when you're using cover slips, and that material could move very quickly over to the edge, and you would be near the edge of the cover slip. You wouldn't even know it was there because there'd be so much contrast. But even if a hair might be laying right next to another hair or on top of it, it may even look like an extension of the hair. You really couldn't even see that, whether there was one hair or 2 hairs or however many.
Prior to beginning your mounting process, sir, do you make any effort to determine how long or how short the hairs are that you're going to mount?
Yes, I have that ruler down there, and I measure the hair and put it on a slide and make a notation. Most of the slides that are prepared, I make a note of the longest hair that I place on the slide. Sometimes at a later date, this is may not work out so well because the hair that you find that looks like the individual known standard may be shorter than that measurement that you got. You might say under 6 inches or so on the slide, and the hair that you're looking at is 2 inches. And you have to go back with some thread and try to figure it out, and it works out pretty well. But you can take the slide apart at any time. Well, maybe not any time, but at least during the time you're working with it, because it's still workable. It doesn't set like glue real hard, real fast. You may have trouble like 10 years from now.
Because by then it will be set.
Well, it gets set, right, after about 10 years. It's semi-permanent
So
initially.
the slides that you create will permit the examination and re-examination of the hairs and fibers that were mounted for quite a long time to come.
Sure, and often during the examination, material may have to be removed from that slide so that I may make a crack in the cover slip. Cover slip is just a very, very thin sheet of glass that fits on top of the slide just to hold it in place. And a little tap with the scribe allows a crack to form, and then you can remove carefully the material that you want without disturbing the rest of the slide.
But you would be able to tell then that the cover slip was cracked.
You couldn't miss that.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our break for the noon hour. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case, conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you, or allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until 1 p.m. All right, Mr. Deedrick, you're ordered to come back 1 p.m. All right, back on the record in the Simpson matter. All parties are again present. Anything we need to take up before we invite the jurors to join us? Mr. Cochran?
Your Honor, we were not on the record, but at sidebar, we had an indication from the people regarding their list of witnesses to the end of their case, and I'd like to do that on the record if we could at this point, what Ms. Clark told us with regard to not having further witnesses except for Ms. Brown. So if we could just make it clear so we know where we're going to go.
Ms. Clark?
That's correct.
All right, Mrs. Brown?
Mrs. Brown.
Yes.
Was possible last witness, and I indicated that there's a possibility that there may be a stipulation if she's interested in that. The other thing, Your Honor, I want to show Ms. Clark something and then just address some.
All right.
What I wanted to point out was just a couple things to Ms. Clark I was showing her. In some photographs we had from them, you remember the issue we talked about yesterday about the photograph of Mr. Simpson that was gone on the board? And I'm not usually one to belabor issues, but in their very photographs, Your Honor, why are you looking up, Your Honor, like that? I don't understand
Well,
that.
that was a rolling of the
Oh,
eyes.
that
is
rolling,
what that was.
the rolling of the eyes. I don't know what that meant. Your Honor, with regard to this, there is a photograph that they wanted to show. There's a photograph right next to it in the book. And I'd like for you to see these two photographs. And it seems to me if they want to be fair, they'd show this photograph in my left hand as opposed to this. They took the one where he looks the worst, and they're taken at the same time. But one is has a scowl or whatever. It just seems to me fundamental fairness would require them to choose one at least to be fair. And that's the thing we're talking about. So would you mind looking at these two
I'll
and
look
see if
at
the
'em.
point is not well taken? I showed it to Ms. Clark, and she indicated she hadn't seen the other. It's from her book, so I wanted to.
All right, I'll take a look at it.
The boards are done, Your Honor. It's all been completed now. I would point out also that, we had a choice between a serious picture, a Ronald Goldman serious picture and one in which he was smiling, and also selected the more serious picture in his case. But I didn't know there was another booking photograph. But the board is complete, and
When do you anticipate getting to that?
depends on how long.
Well, we're going to go straight through till 3 o'clock. Do you anticipate getting to this before then?
No.
Okay, let's proceed. Let's have the jurors. Please be seated. All right, Mr. Deedrick, could you resume the witness stand, please? All right, right, good afternoon, Mr. Deedrick.
Good afternoon.
You're reminded, sir, you are still under oath, and Ms. Clark, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Okay, when we last left off, you had indicated you had finished telling us about how you mount hairs and fibers on slides.
All right.
And after you complete the mounting of the hairs and fibers, what do you do with the completed slides?
Well, the slides are placed individually on a slide holder in numerical order. From that position, they're taken to a research microscope for examination under low magnification, and then through the whole process.
Now, do you change paper between the preparation of each slide?
Yes.
And were all of these slides prepared in the manner you've described in this case?
They were.
Did you mount all of the hairs and fibers that were found in the paper folds on slides?
I did not.
And why is that?
Well, some of the hairs that were found or fibers that were found were consistent with others that I had mounted from the same material, such as from the gloves. There were some fibers, animal fibers, that were present. I didn't mount those. Sometimes representative samples are prepared from material.
Nevertheless, are all of those fibers and hairs maintained, whether they're on slides or not?
Right. They're either on the slides or they're in the original folded paper.
And so if anyone wants to re-examine them in the future, they can do so, whether in slides or paper.
Yes, they could.
Okay, who mounted the questioned hairs in this case?
I did.
And were the known standards, that is, the samples taken from people's heads and from various cloths, were they mounted using the same procedure you just described?
They were.
And who did the mounting
Well,
of the knowns?
Well, the original known set of hairs was prepared by Susan Brockbank of the Los Angeles Police Department Crime Laboratory. All the other known samples that I received later, I prepared.
Okay, and so then when you say the original known samples, who are you referring to?
That would have been from the defendant and also from the two victims.
Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown?
That's right.
When Susan prepared those slides of their hair standards, was she in the same room with you?
She was.
Was she at the same desktop with you?
No, she was at a technician position, which is in front of my desk.
And did you observe the procedure she followed?
I did. I gave her some instruction as well as how I would like to see the slides prepared.
And did she do so according to your direction?
She initially started using her own just out of habit, and we decided that it was easier and more time-saving to do them the way that we normally do them.
Now, do you mount more than one hair or fiber on a slide?
Sure.
How many do you usually mount, either hairs or fibers, on one slide?
Well, with hairs, it just depends on the racial origin, the length of the hair, the thickness of the hair, the curliness of the hair. It has a lot to do with it. There could be 5, there could be 3, there could be 15. It just depends upon the hair.
And what do you mean by that? It depends upon the hair. Do you group them?
Well, if a hair is removed from some debris and it's 20 inches long and it's from an Asian, you know, it's going to be a big hair. You might only mount one hair on that slide because it takes up a lot of the space. You're only given a little less than 1 inch by 3 inch space to mount that material. But if you have shorter hairs that are, let's say, half an inch long, for instance, from a black individual or from a white individual, you might be able to prepare more. You don't want the cover slip and the per mount to be too thick. Otherwise, it's kind of like floating around in a submarine trying to figure out where these hairs are. You want it to make a pretty flat mount. So it depends on the hair.
Okay, well, at the time that Susan Brockbank was mounting the known standards on slides, what were you doing?
I was looking through the question debris, question material, and preparing slides myself.
Well, what's the possibility of any of the known standards she was working on jumping over onto your slides on the other desk?
No, that's not a possibility. It's too much space in between, and there are no air currents to speak of in that room.
Can you describe that room a little bit?
Well, the room is about probably 15 by 15 There are 2 examiners' positions, and in front of the examiner's positions are the technician positions. So each room will have 2 examiners and 2 technicians, and there'll be microscopes at each location.
So is it common to have 2 people working on slide mounting at the same time in that room?
Could be 4 people mounting on, working on slide mounting, slide preparation.
Now, after the mounting is completed, what happens next?
Well, once the slides are prepared, they're, again, laid out in numerical order, and I follow the process of looking at the question material first. I try to look to see what do I find at the crime scene, what do I find on items from the victims, and then I move to the accused or the suspect in the case, and then I look at the known standards in that order. I just want to see first what I have. In the slide preparation, normally the slide preparation goes question material first and then known. And that's to avoid having the knowns exposed.
So you deliberately separate by starting with the questioned hairs and fibers?
Well, you do everything you can to avoid any possible contamination. You're concerned about that. We know the risk that it's involved with contamination. So you take every effort possible to avoid that, so that what you're seeing is actually what was on the item.
And you did that in this case?
Every case is treated that way.
You see a photograph before you. I'd ask that it, Your Honor, be marked 462. This will be a series. Could I ask that it be 462A?
All right, 462.
And I think we already saw this marked as 461, but is this the exam? No, we didn't? This is new. Oh, this is new. Can you tell us what's shown in this photograph, sir?
Well, here the examiner is looking at the slide using the stereo microscope. It may be the first step for some examiners to examine that slide in that way. Low magnification. We start at about, it could be 10x and go up to maybe 40 or 50 times magnification.
Now, in this initial examination, you're looking for what?
Well, you're looking for, if you're looking at hairs, mainly racial characteristics can be distinguished. Length, color, shape, contour, appearance of the tip, appearance of the root. It's easier to see in that instance, perhaps, the apparent shape of the hair itself, the three-dimensional shape of the hair, because you're looking at it in 3 dimensions. But it's just a low magnification screening tool to look through the hairs, to identify which hairs that you may want to look at under higher magnification.
Okay. Is it at this point that you determine, is there such a thing as a hair not suitable for further analysis or comparison purposes?
Sure, there are hairs that aren't worth comparing.
And why would that happen?
Well, there are head hairs, pubic hairs, and some facial hairs are routinely the hairs that are compared microscopically. Hairs from the arm, from the leg, body hairs, for instance, from the trunk of the body, back hairs, eye hairs, eyebrows, eyelashes. These hairs are not routinely compared in forensic laboratories, nor are they compared by us routinely. It may be of some interest in some instances where someone may be hit with like a club hit in the face, and on the club you find eye hairs that are embedded in the club, then that takes on a little more significance. But looking at debris found on clothing or from vacuum sweepings from a floor, they probably shouldn't play a very significant role in any hair identification.
So what is it that causes you to determine whether a hair is or is not suitable for comparison purposes?
Well, if they fall into the categories of the types of hairs worth comparing, it's just experience and the hair itself. You look at the hair, you determine from experience if it's worth comparing, there's enough of the hair to work with, and if it's, again, from that region. And sometimes some hairs are very distinctive. You might not need a whole lot of hair to make a comparison.
So you're looking to have a sufficient quantity of distinctive characteristics?
Well, there's no set number of characteristics that are needed to make a comparison. That's up to the examiner and the experience of the examiner, and how many hairs they've seen, what types of hairs they've seen, what is unusual, what is usual. And based on all that, the decision is made to determine to whether or not to compare it with a known standard.
Now, the next slide, next photograph that's on the screen now, 462B. Can you tell us what's being depicted in that photograph?
Well, that's just a close-up view of the slide. It's difficult to see perhaps, but the slide on the stage of the stereo binocular microscope.
And 462C, can you tell us what do we see in this photograph?
Well, here the examiner is sitting at the comparison microscope, and that's really one of the main tools of the unit. And that's the tool that is used to take a questioned piece of material, like a hair or a fiber, and compare it in the same field of view with the known material. For instance, if a hair were recovered from a weapon or from an item, it would be mounted on a glass microscope slide. Now, that instrument, there are two microscopes there. One microscope would be used for the question slide. The other microscope would be used for the slide containing the known hairs from the individual. And by looking through the eyepieces, which he's doing here, those eyepieces will allow you to see both of the hairs at the same time. The same type of comparison is done with fibers. You're comparing question material, known material in the same field of view. More people are familiar with comparing bullets. I mean, I grew up and that's all I ever saw in TV shows was comparing scratch marks on bullets to see if this bullet came from this gun. And they'd line up the striations and you could see them. The difference here is that the material that we're looking at, we're looking actually through it. We're looking inside of it to look at the characteristics because we're using transmitted light and not reflected light.
Now, do you count the number of characteristics that you find in hair samples?
I don't know.
And why is that?
Well, I don't necessarily think there's a minimum number of characteristics that one needs for making an identification. You look at everything. You look at all the characteristics that you see. And based upon all of these things that you're looking at, an opinion is reached based on that. Not on how many notes you take, not on how many points that you write down in your notes. It's actually based on what you're seeing.
So what component does experience, the number of hairs that you've compared and looked at in your tenure as an examiner, what component does experience in that play in all this?
Well, a good hair examiner has a lot of scope time, has a lot of time looking at hairs. The more things you see, the more value judgments you can make regarding what something is worth. We do this every day ourselves in our own everyday experiences, and I just do it from a microscopic standpoint. We value things all the time, and I place value or importance on certain characteristics that I see under the microscope. So the more time you have, the more decisions you can make that are of value. But still, people that come through the training after a year are still going to be seeing a lot more hairs than what many people would ever look at. And within several years, they have a pretty broad base. But I've seen, obviously, a lot more.
Now, as you examine, you talked about notes, sir. As you examine the slides, are you taking notes about what you see?
I take notes on, again, the question items first. I look to determine if there are hairs present, the type of hair, animal, human, race, body area, the condition of the root, approximate length of the hair, if the hair had any treatment. I may indicate if it's not suitable for comparison or suitable for comparison. And I just move through the material that way from item to item until I get to the knowns. The known hair slides are examined more carefully at this point because I want to make sure I have a good idea in my mind of the characteristics of this individual. I then can go to the comparison scope and make the comparison. It doesn't take the comparison scope initially Once you get through to the question material, you have a pretty good idea what the hairs of this person look like, or what the hairs of this person look like, because they're on their own clothes. When you get to the known hairs, you look at the characteristics and the lights go on. I've seen that hair before. I've seen those hairs before. And you just go back through the question material and compare them side by side.
And when you say side by side, you have a chart, Your Honor, asked it to be marked People's 463.
All right, 463.
Can you tell us, sir, what this chart shows us?
Well, it kind of gives you an idea of what you're looking at through the comparison microscope. And essentially, it looks like that first chart you saw with a line drawn down the center. And that's the dividing line between your two microscopes. The best possible match, the one you try to really get, is where you have a mirror image setup. That the hair on the left, which is in here the known hair, and the hair on the right, which is the question hair, if you looked at them together, they would appear to be one hair. And that's what you try to do when you're trying to determine if a question hair looks like the known hairs.
And that's the field of vision that you have, that circle with a line through it?
Right, well, you can see the hair kind of goes outside the circle, but the field of view is it's a circular field, a white background, and it has a center hairline down the middle, which separates your two specimens or your two microscopes.
Now, is everyone's hair the same? For example, my hair, okay? I almost lost it. We have one hair. If I pull out this one hair over here, is it going to look the same as, say, a hair over here?
With your hair, they probably are going to be pretty close. But with
Commenting on something?
Yeah, well,
All right.
with most people, there's pretty good range. I mean, there could be a range from you might have a dark hair, a coarser hair on one side, and you might have a finer hair on the other side. That's why we require that the coroner, whoever's collecting the hair samples from the individual, take pullings from different areas of the head as well as combings, because you got to have a couple things working here. You have hairs that are actively growing, and you have hairs that are ready to fall out, and they don't look the same. They look a little different. So I request that we get at least 25 to 30 pulled hairs, and then take combings as well, so that you can get a good idea as to the types of hairs that if they were pulled out, what they would look like, and if they fell out naturally, what they would look like. And use all of these hairs in forming an idea about the characteristics of the known hair.
Okay, so then, is there like a range of characteristics for each person's hair?
There is a range of characteristics, sure. And when I look at the individual hairs from a sample, I determine what the average hair is. You can do that. You can look at them and say, well, I see hairs that pretty much fall within a pretty narrow range, and you're going to have some hairs that are on the outsider edge of that range. But you include all of those into the characterization or the analysis or the storyline that you're writing on these known hairs. This range of characteristics, though, from my experience, is a much narrower range than what you see out in the population, out in other people.
Well, let me ask you to amplify that a little bit more, because if each of us has a range of characteristics, couldn't a hair from the back of my head match the hair from the front of another juror's head or Mr. Darden's? You know what I mean? If there's a range, then why? I shouldn't bring Mr. Darden into hair discussions. I won't do it anymore. You know what I mean? If we all have a range, then isn't there going to be an overlap? How can you say that any hair didn't come from someone else?
Well, as I said, there is a range with each person. Everybody has a range of characteristics. Some people have a broad range. Some people have a lot of hairs that look very similar to each other. It makes it a little bit easier if they're closer together than if they're far apart. But the overlapping aspects, that you might say that a hair that you find on one person's head, it may have some similarities to another person's hair. There may be some overlap, but it won't match. I mean, it may look somewhat similar, but it won't exhibit the same microscopic characteristics.
Strike that word match.
Yes. Jury is to
Sorry.
disregard the term match in this context. Thank you.
Can we
Proceed.
replace that term with the same microscopic characteristics?
I meant to say that they won't exhibit the same microscopic characteristics. That is, they won't look the same.
Now, you mentioned, if you looked at, that my hairs would probably all look very similar. You're referring to color treatment, correct?
Well, I think the color treatment would be a big help, yes.
And you could see if someone had color treatment in their hair under the microscope.
Oh, very, very easily, yes.
But even if someone has color-treated hair, some kind of treatment with respect to the color, will you still see some kind of a range of characteristics?
Oh, you will, sure. And for instance, some of your hairs may be lighter than others, and they may not have as much pigment. They'll take on a much brighter color than a hair that is darker, that has absorbed the same amount of color. So you will see pigment granules, you'll see medulla, you'll see cuticle, scales, ovoid bodies. You see it all, unless it's so darkly dyed that they're covered up, and that's possible.
So when you mount a known hair standard from a given individual, for example, in this case, the defendant's known sample or Nicole's known sample, do you make any effort to assure that you represent the range of characteristics that you've seen in their sample on the slides?
That selection, yes, I do. That selection is made as you're taking hairs from the container, the original container, whether it's using a stereo microscope or using your own eyes to see length, thickness, color, and a range. I mean, her hairs, for instance, appeared to have some highlighting or treatment to them. So and some hairs didn't appear to have too much. So it's just a matter of collecting hairs that exhibited all those characteristics.
So that you accurately represent the range of that person's hair?
Well, the first thing you do is you mount up what you think is a range, a good range, and then you go to your material. You may find a hair for instance, on an item of clothing from that person, and you see a lot of similarities with the knowns that you prepared, but maybe something that doesn't quite right. It looks a little different. You may have to go back and mount additional hairs from the known sample, just so that you can increase that range a little bit. You may see something that may not quite be present, and you want to clarify it. You may need to go back and mount more hairs. And once in a while in a case, it happens all the time, that I would call back out to the contributors or the police department and say, I don't think you gave me a good enough known standard, or I need hair combings. Can I have additional hairs so that I can make sure that what I'm seeing either looks like it or doesn't look like it? I want to make sure that before I reach a conclusion that it's a valid association or exclusion.
Now, during the examination of known standards in any case, do you make any effort to see whether you can distinguish between the known standards? For example, in this case, you had the known standards of Ron Goldman and of Nicole Brown. Did you make any effort to determine whether you could tell them apart?
That's the first thing you have to do. When you're looking at known material, you want to make sure that the people you're going to be comparing the questionnaires to look different. If they look the same, the conclusions or the strength of the association would be minimized. They could have come from either individual.
Well, has that ever happened?
Not in casework since I've been working. All the known samples that I've gotten over the years, and that there have been quite a few, I've never had a problem being able to distinguish the victims of a case and the suspects of the case, and multiple suspects. I've had cases where I've had 200 or 300 or 400 known hair samples as elimination or possible suspects to compare with question hairs found at a crime scene or on a body of a young child, a victim of a case. And it's a job. The one thing you have to do is make sure they all look different. And it's pretty easy to do.
And you've never had any trouble being able to distinguish between two different people's
Now,
hair?
samples are pretty easy to distinguish. You have some problems with identical twins. Identical twins can be real close, especially if they happen to live in the same environment and they share very many common things. Because environment and diet and how much sun they get, how they treat their hair, all of these things add the differences that are often seen between hairs that may be very close microscopically. A person may take maybe an alcoholic, for instance. We had a case one time where there were brothers. Their hairs looked very close, but one person had...
This is way beyond the question.
Sustained. Ask another question.
Sorry.
Well, let me ask you this. How many known hair samples have you examined in your capacity?
Easily 10,000, easily.
In the course of that experience, sir, have you ever had occasion to examine the hairs of multiple family members?
I have.
And in that experience, were all the family members were, say, of the same race?
They were.
Same hair color?
No.
How did you distinguish? They were the same. What were they? Were they siblings? Were they mother and father?
I don't think that's relevant to this case.
Both. I mean, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers.
Were you always able to distinguish between them?
Yes, you can distinguish between them. Sometimes you'll have family members that are pretty close. But for the most part, you can distinguish between even siblings or family members. Again, because
Yeah,
the,
that's what I was
the
gonna ask.
characteristics that I look at are not based solely on genetics. I mean, we know that even brothers and sisters, unless they're identical twins, I mean, they're different. I mean, they just look different. And their hairs also tend to look different as part of this unique thing that we have as a human being.
Well, apart from genetics, is there something about the way a person lives that will make their hair distinguishable from another person's hair?
Sure.
For example?
Well, a person that doesn't wash their hair very much may have dirt and debris and other material in the hair shaft, underneath the cuticle or the scales of the cuticle. A person may pick up head lice, pubic lice. You can see those on the hair shaft. A person may have also a lot of damage to the hair. It's not a clean hair. It's subject to a lot of damage. This might be characteristic of the type of person that he is or she is.
So, for example, if you got the known standards from two family members whose hair color was the same and who are of the same race, would you be able to distinguish between them based on these other characteristics that you're describing?
Well, hair color and race are pretty broad categories. I mean, if you say brown Caucasian as an example, there's a lot of people with brown hair that are white. I mean, just an awful lot. So that's pretty broad categorization. There are other characteristics that you look for besides just color and racial characteristics, and that's where you see the differences.
Have you been able to distinguish between the hair of two brown-haired Caucasian people in the past?
You do it all the time, in the cases that you get in, as well as the tests that you prepare.
You were mentioning two brothers, one of which was alcoholic earlier. Does that show up in the hair?
Habits, alcohol abuse, drug abuse will affect hair characteristics. There may be characteristics found within the hair shaft that I've seen over the years that may be characteristic of that person's habits. And sometimes they may be the only characteristics that can be used if they're that close microscopically. But hairs are kind of the dumping ground, right? They're kind of the dumping ground of the body. I mean, we have...
Sustained. Ask another question.
Well, you say hairs are kind of the dumping ground. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, it's a structure that materials are excreted or secreted in so that they can leave the body of a person. As an example, if a person has been poisoned, and this has been documented in a lot of cases with arsenic, that by looking at the hair, one can determine that arsenic is in fact present in the hair. If a person is a drug user, the drugs will be excreted or secreted into the hair shaft, and they can be tested that way. And it's a test that is more commonly being used for employment type matters, rather than invade the body with taking blood samples,
Non-responsive, irrelevant.
they take hair samples. So it's just it's a structure of the body that helps the body get rid of things.
Now, in this case, I believe you indicated that you initially got the known standards of the defendant, Ron Goldman, and Nicole Brown, correct?
I did.
And I believe you also testified you were able to distinguish each of their hairs from each other.
I was.
Did each of the individuals, for example, did Ron Goldman's hair display distinctive characteristics?
It did.
Did Nicole Brown's hair also display distinctive characteristics?
They did.
And also the defendant's hair?
They did.
Okay, with respect, I'll start with the defendant first. Did you find, with respect to those distinctive characteristics, at the FBI, do you maintain reference samples of photographs of hairs from people of various racial groups?
We do.
And for what purpose do you do that?
For training, primarily.
Did you bring one of those charts with you here?
I did prepare a chart, yes.
Can you see that? Right, thank you.
May this be marked People's 464, Your Honor?
People's 464.
Thank you. So, are these all photographs that you have at the FBI?
Well, no, I photographed them. Those were hairs of different black individuals, blacks from this country and from Africa.
Okay. So, tell us what you're trying to demonstrate with this chart.
These are hairs that were taken just at random from samples from individuals that were in the reference collection. There's one there from a bushman from Africa, one from a Somali warrior, a couple of them from individuals that work in the laboratory. I think you see there's a blue hair there, I believe, is one of them. That's a treatment. She's a clerk typist in the unit. I think there's another one that has a red coloration to it. And again, I don't recall what type of treatment that was, mahogany rinse or something like that. But the other hairs just represent some randomness, some random variation that is exhibited between different individuals to show you that the hairs do differ microscopically.
Did you also prepare a chart of photographs of Caucasian hairs?
I did.
Is that the next one up, Dana? I'd ask that this chart be marked 465, Your Honor.
465.
Okay, before we move on to discuss this, let me ask you just a couple more questions. You indicated that the defendant's hair was distinctive.
I did.
And what was distinctive about it?
Well, it was very light colored. It had very light pigmentation, prominent one-sided pigmentation, which was prominent in many of the hairs in the sample. There's a number of other characteristics as well. I have them jotted down in my notes, but I felt that those hairs were very distinctive, easy to select.
All right, now you indicated that with respect to Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, you also found distinctive characteristics, and here we have the Board 465. Can you tell us what you're showing us in these 16 different photographs?
Well, there's a couple things, I believe, in this chart, trying to show that there's a variation or randomness to the color, to the pigmentation, distribution, to medulation, or the medulla that you see running down. Some of the hairs have them, some don't. You may find it in a one person anyway. You may find hairs that don't have a medulla and others that do. Again, it just shows some of the variation. The three pictures on the right I had to bring in. They're my daughter's hairs. On the right, second one, third one, and fourth one, starting from the oldest to the youngest.
Can you step down and show us which ones those are? 'Cause
Sure.
I couldn't tell. You want to use the pointer?
No.
Okay.
This is my 17-year-old's hair. This is my 13-year-old. She was a little upset because her hairs have some damage to it.
She
And
didn't
the
want to be.
youngest-
She didn't want them on TV.
She didn't want them on TV.
Okay.
And the youngest here has the darker hairs of the three. Again, trying to show that there is some variation even within a family, that they will exhibit different characteristics.
Thank you. All right, so you indicated that you examined question hairs, and then you examine the knowns, and then you go to the comparison process?
That's right.
And you indicated to us the use of the comparison microscope. Let me ask you this. When you compare the question hairs to the question hairs that are recovered from evidence at a crime scene to the known hairs of an individual that were collected, what would you say if only one hair from the known standard exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as the questioned hair?
That's a tough one. It depends upon the hair, how many hairs were recovered, where it was recovered. It may have something to do with whether or not it might be reported. If a hair is on the outer edge of the range, a lot of times those are just thrown out. You don't consider them as a potential. And it's just logic, it's common sense. Here, what would you expect to see if this guy shed hairs at the crime scene? Well, he would lose hairs like most of his hairs. He wouldn't lose, maybe, isn't it just strange that he happened to lose one that looks kind of like one of the weird hairs in his head? I'd throw it out. I'd rather just throw it out and not involve him at all in that type of examination.
So do you try to err on the side of being conservative in your conclusions?
Sustained.
In forming your conclusions, how do you have some kind of standard that you go by in terms of trying to benefit the suspect?
Well, it's objectivity, impartiality. You don't get involved with the case. You try to report out truthfully what you see based upon the observations you make, with no concern with the outcome. And it's normally a default mechanism built into it. If there's any question, you throw it out. You don't try to make a match. You either matches or, I say matches again, I'm sorry, it's,
Instruct the witness.
yeah.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, you were to disregard the term match in this context.
You either have the same microscopic characteristics
You have to apologize because some of that comes out naturally, but yeah, if it exhibits the same, if it exhibits the same microscopic characteristics, you call it that way. If there are some differences and you can't account for them, you throw it out.
No.
All right, so for example, well, strike that. We're talking about same microscopic characteristics and when you'll form a conclusion, but let me ask you this, sir. Can you say that a hair found at a crime scene, even though it exhibits the same microscopic characteristics as the hair taken from a suspect, even though you say that, can you say that it could only have come from this person and no other in the world?
No, no, we do not say with absolute certainty that a hair came from a particular person, no matter where the hair is found.
Are there databases that tell you what percentage of the population could have been the source of any particular question hair?
No.
And when you say that you don't say that, you don't say that a hair could only have come from one person and no other, why is that?
Well, because you can see that in some individuals that there are hairs that can be, they can look very similar to another individual. So that in that instance, just because it happens, you can't make a blanket statement and say that it's a positive form of identification. If it happens once, it happens twice, you cannot say absolutely, and we don't say that. Every report that we send out has a statement in it to that effect.
Now, is use of the microscope to perform the examinations considered to be the best method of comparing hairs in the forensic community at this time?
We think so, yes.
Is there any instrumental means of comparison currently recognized as reliable that have gained acceptance in the scientific community other than microscopic comparison?
There have been other techniques, other instrumental methods that have been used, none considered to be useful to individualize hairs.
Dr. Clark, are you going to use 465 any longer?
Not anymore. You want me to take that?
Yeah. Seem to be blocking juror number 7 again.
All right. Let's talk about fibers for a minute. Tell us what a fiber is.
Well, a fiber is the smallest piece of a fabric, essentially.
Are there different kinds of fibers?
There are naturally occurring fibers, such as from an animal. Woolen fibers is a good example. Cotton fibers that come from plants. So plants provide textile fibers. And also there are man-made fibers. And there's some others, but man-made and naturally occurring are the two main groups.
We have a chart here, Your Honor. It's on the screen. Asked to be marked People's 466.
People's 466.
Can you see the chart, sir? That's been marked as People's 466
I can see it fine.
on your monitor? Okay.
Yes.
Tell us what is shown in this chart.
Well, in the upper right-hand portion of the chart, you see what is depicted as a cotton fiber. And it's probably the most common plant fiber that we wear. And cotton is used for a lot of other things besides wearing, but it's the most common plant fiber. It comes from a seed boll. It's a seed fiber. The fiber beneath it is a woolen fiber. It's an example of a wool fiber taken from a sheep. Woolen fibers can come from other types of animals as well. They don't have to come from sheep. It could come from a woolen fiber from a goat, would be a good example. Camel hair, another one. Cashmere goat is a good example. It's just an example of an animal fiber.
And is that how it appears microscopically?
Well, that's just an artist's depiction of it. Yes, it can. You can see the scales on the outermost portion of the hair. Woolen fibers are hairs, just animal hairs. They look differently microscopically. And some woolen fibers are very fine, not a lot of scale protrusion. They're comfortable to wear. That's what we like to wear. Those woolen fibers that are coarse, that are rough, you might be walking on them. They're not as expensive, so we walk on them. But you wouldn't want to wear them.
Okay. And then man-made,
Well, the man-made fiber, it might be a little difficult to pick out here. On the right, upper left, you see what looks like a longitudinal view. If you looked at the fiber underneath the microscope, and the borders on the top and the bottom are the borders of the fiber. All right, and it's just cut off at the ends. It has in it a number of structures that may be found. Delustering particles may be added to the fiber to take away the shininess of it. It's just a pigment that's added to the fiber when it's produced. They may also have voids, or just large spaces with nothing in them, or they may have pigment in them. So these are just examples of what you might see in a man-made fiber.
down below that, I see shape and cross-section.
Well, shape and cross-section are an identifying characteristic, especially of man-made fibers, because the industry designs and produces their fibers for specific end uses. The carpets that you walk on may have a much different shape and size, or they would, than the clothing that you wear on your body. You wouldn't be wearing a rug around, nor would you walk on lingerie. I mean, it's just not that way. There's a design and a purpose for each of the fibers that are produced, and certain fiber types have certain shapes, and that's depicted there.
So does this chart kind of explain to us what you can tell from the microscopic examination of fibers?
Well, that's kind of the first thing, right? That you can look at and see right off with a man-made fiber or a natural fiber.
Is that like your first determination?
Just like that first determination with hairs. Is it plant? Is it animal? Is it man-made?
Thanks, John. Your Honor, I have here a chart that's marked entitled Cotton Fibers. I'd ask it to be marked 467.
467.
Thank you. Tell us what this chart shows, sir. Would
Well,
you like to step down and
it
point?
might be easier to see.
Sure. Is there a pointer? It's only the little one.
Ms. Clark.
Please tell us about this chart.
What I've done here is try to give you an idea of what can happen to cotton fibers that you might wear or you may encounter. Cotton fibers, they're pretty common. We make 5 billion pounds of cotton fibers every year, just here in the United States. They go to a lot of different sources. They may go into clothing, draperies, upholstery. There's a lot of end uses for cotton. The distinguishing features of cotton can be seen in the color, whereas a fiber that is uniformly colored would look different than a cotton fiber that had color at specific intervals or different portions of the fiber. The surface color that is seen in this particular cotton fiber would be characteristic of a printed fabric, where the color is added to the surface of the fabric after it's produced. Uniform color might be made or produced when the yarns are coming off, after the yarns have been spun and the whole yarn is dyed. The degree of twist is something that's compared. This is a gray, a greige fiber, like a cotton ball. You may see this particular unfinished fiber in blue jeans. It's a good example. A fiber that is more finished, it's been through a little bit more processing, will take a little bit of the twist out. You might find that in a shirt or a blouse. Mercerized cotton has been treated differently. you find mercerized cotton in threads. It doesn't have very much of these what are called convolutions or twists, back and forth twists that is commonly found in cotton fibers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Escobar. This is a chart I'd ask to be marked Peoples 468.
All right, so marked.
Can you tell us, first of all, you told us about the cotton fibers. Now, is this chart about man-made fibers?
Right, it's a little bit of education on how man-made fibers are produced.
Can you explain to us, starting wherever you want? I see the one that the title up to the upper left is cellulosic. What does that mean?
Well, cellulosic refers to the origin, that is, wood pulp, cotton linters, something that has cellulose or material, it's natural, as a substrate, as a base material. It's a starting material that you work with.
So cellulosic would mean a natural substance for the starting material?
Right. Some of the first fibers, the man-made fibers that were produced were cellulosic in nature. That is, they started with something that was naturally occurring. They put some chemicals together and they extruded it into a fiber shape.
Extruded?
Well, if I can step down, I'll point
Please.
that out. Thank you. Okay. When man-made fibers are produced, they have to start with some beginning substance. Some start with a cellulose-based substance. Others start with other chemicals and perhaps even like a plastic chip. They melt the chip and then they make fibers out of it. But from this beginning solution, it is forced under pressure out of what's called the spinneret. It looks like it's a shower head. And the shape of each one of these little holes and the processing itself has something to do with this cross-section that you see, the shape of the fiber that comes out of it. Dry spinning, it's forced out into air. Rayon, which is cellulosic, acetate, and triacetates take on these particular shapes. And as they dry, they crimp. And it looks like you have a striated or streaky fiber as it's laying on a glass microscope slide. With non-cellulosics, we see that nylon, polyester, acrylic, monocrylic, olefin. Olefin would be like polypropylene, polyethylene substance with maybe either melt spun or wet spun. It may be extruded or pushed out of this spinneret into a liquid vat, or it may be again into air